Welcome to this panel on equality in the law and the push for diversity. My name is Jenna Green, and I write the legal action column for Reuters. I'm joined by Goodwin Liu. He is an Associate Justice of the California Supreme Court. Before being appointed to the state's highest court in 2011, Justice Liu was a professor of law and associate dean at UC Berkeley School of Law. Dev Stalkoff is the corporate vice president and general counsel for Microsoft. She joined Microsoft in 2007 as a senior attorney and was promoted to her current role in 2018. Benjamin Wilson is the chairman of Washington, D.C. based law firm Beveridge and Diamond. He established the African American General Counsel and Managing Partner Networks in 2012 and founded the Diverse Partner Network in 2008. Thank you all for being here. So as long as I've been covering the legal profession, which is more than 20 years, lawyers in the United States have been talking about the need for greater diversity in their ranks. But according to the most recent statistics from the Bureau of Labor, law remains one of the least diverse professions in the nation. Lawyers are 86% white, which compares unfavorably with professions like accountants, architects, engineers, and doctors. Law also remains male dominated. At the nation's 200 biggest law firms, only 19% of equity partners are women. So my initial question is why? Why has change proven so difficult? And I'm wondering if each of you might sort of highlight one thing you see as a primary obstacle to greater diversity. And perhaps Justice Lee, would you like to start?
Sure, and thank you. It's a pleasure to be here today. Well, I think the first thing to keep in mind is that lawyers serve society. We're one of the few professions that take an oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States, and it's especially important that lawyers as a profession reflect the society that they serve. And so diversity is super important for that reason. I think the aggregate statistic you gave about the legal profession, of course, reflects generations of lawyers, including many lawyers who went to law school at a time when very few minorities and women went to law school or perhaps even made it to higher education. And so there is a just generational lag in terms of the overall composition of lawyers. If you look at today's law students, more than more than a third of them are students of color. Interestingly, in 2016, women surpassed men in enrollment in law school. And so I think change is on the horizon. If you just look at the incoming cohorts of lawyers, they look a lot different than the overall statistics you gave. And so some of it is just the changes that we see in society coming over time. I know we'll spend some time in this half hour talking about obstacles that remain, but I think there's reason to be optimistic that just demographically, if you look at the trend line, lawyers will be becoming more diverse as we go forward.
What about you, Deb? What's your take?
Thank you so much for having me on the panel this morning. So I would agree with Justice Liu's optimism. I do think an aspect of this is generational. I think though we as a legal profession, we focus on pedigree and network and things like that in a way that other professions may not be quite as attached. And so where you went to law school is critically important. You know, I still today, more than 20 years in the profession, get asked that question. You know, where did you go to law school? When did you graduate? Do you know so-and-so? And I think those structural network things play into then kind of the structure we create as a business model where work is assigned, clients choose lawyers they're working with. And it's kind of this reinforcing the status quo structure that we've created that we need to be really intentional about sort of breaking through.
Well, if I might jump in, please. I do agree with Justice Liu that some of the disparity can be explained by generational differences. And yet, the number of equity women partners in law firms has hovered between 17 and 19% for a number of years now. And women have been going to law school in roughly equal numbers as for men for a while. The recent American Bar Association studies, and not so recent now, of the late 2000s and early 2010s, show very much a fundamental different experience for Black women in law firms who are terribly underrepresented. So I think when we talk about diversity, a broad term that can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people, I think it's essential that we are even more specific. And what I would like to suggest very bluntly is I think that one of the issues, at least as it relates to Black applicants, is sometimes an assumption of inferiority by the majority group, and an assumption that this applicant is not as prepared, not as bright, not as qualified. And so I think that has to be addressed directly and forthrightly. And it is not a comfortable subject, but I believe it's there.
Absolutely. Well, the three of you stand really at the apex of the legal profession. And I'm wondering if you might just briefly share a little bit of your personal stories, if there were instances when you encountered any barriers, and if so, how you responded. Ben, do you want to kick that off?
Well, I will. I can tell you in almost every case I've been involved in until very recent years, I've had that moment where this prove it moment. And I can recall a time, this is dated, but over 20 years ago, I happened to be in New Haven, Connecticut, and my opposing counsel insisted that the judge, Justice Liu, wanted to see us right away. And I had learned to practice in Atlanta, and we were officers of the court. And if my opposing counsel told me something that the court wanted us to do, it was like your mother or father relaying a message through a friend. It was tantamount to an order. Turned out the judge did not want to see us that day, and my opposing counsel wanted to take the deposition of the mayor of that city, who was Italian American, and he wanted to take his deposition during the Thanksgiving holiday when there was not much attention in the papers, and yet he wanted to bring attention to this. He underestimated me because he assumed that I'd never been to New Haven, Connecticut before. And I hadn't been there to practice law, but I'd been there for a football game, and I knew where the law school library was, and I read my cases. And suffice it to say, we defeated his effort to take the deposition of the mayor. So in almost every case, and there comes some point where the question becomes, are you really here, and why are you here? And when that arises, I grit my teeth, I assume a position of aggression, and I proceed to hopefully disabuse the person of whatever assumption they may be having. What I hope, quite frankly, is that this generation of lawyers that's coming now, the generation that Justice Liu talked about, and the very talented people that Deb has talked about, won't have to do that, won't feel this obligation to prove themselves over and over again. And yet, that is how I see it. Now, that has been my experience, and I'm grateful because in most instances, I've been prepared to meet that challenge.
Yeah.
Great story. And I would just add, I mean, I think that, for me, I would say that even getting to law school in the legal profession was something unfamiliar. I like many people who come from immigrant families, I didn't have any lawyers in my family, and just knowing something about the legal system in this country was not something available to me as a matter of background. And so just getting a foot in the door, finding a mentor, finding someone to encourage you in that direction was something that was late, I think, in coming. Not until after college, really, did I even consider it. There are some interesting data that bear on this, especially with respect to Asian Americans. It turns out that Asian Americans, among all the groups, consider law school later in their educational careers. And that's not surprising given the family backgrounds of many of these folks. I would also say that what Ben described in terms of treatment by judges and perceptions was interestingly, there's some analogs there too. When we did a study of some 600 Asian American lawyers in 2017, I teamed up with Yale Law School students to do this study. We found that a lot of them, especially women lawyers, talked about the fact that they were not perceived as lawyers, meaning they would go into the courtroom and the judge or whoever was in charge, even sometimes the court clerk, would think that they were the translator, the witness, the client, in one instance, even the client's girlfriend. The inference was that you were anyone but the lawyer. It was not credible to think that you were the person who was appearing. And you know, this, I think, has a number of possible effects. Some of our respondents in our study said, you know, this does have a kind of damaging psychological effect to give people, you know, imposter syndrome and the like. Other people said, well, you know, they set the bar so low for me that I was sure I was going to clear it. So people, you know, react to these situations all kinds of different ways, but it just shows you that we still have a long way to go in normalizing the idea that lawyers look different and can come in all different shapes, sizes, backgrounds, and colors. And so that, I think, is, as much as anything, a big challenge still for the profession.
Dev?
Yeah, Jenna, for me, the experience I would share is probably familiar for a number of women. Like Ben's example, mine is a bit dated, but you know, for me, one of the most challenging times was navigating the time frame when my boys were born and having that be something that could fit with a career. At that point, I was in private practice, and although the firm that I was with had paid maternity leave, I got a phone call, you know, 5 weeks into maternity leave saying, hey, there's this great opportunity, no pressure, you don't have to come back. But if you want to come back early, you know, you can be second chair in this trial. And, you know, I was really torn. On the one hand, you know, no pressure. On the other hand, you're an associate thinking, gosh, if I don't take this opportunity, what does that mean for my future? And so I came back and, you know, did that with maternity leave for both of my children. And, you know, looking back now, I think I would have had the fortitude to push back. But at that point, you know, really didn't have the ability to. And then as I re-onboarded, there just weren't the structures in place to provide any flexibility, you know, no flexible hours, no flexibility to not be in the office for set hours. And so I wound up essentially striking a deal to work part-time, even though I was working full-time, so that I could fill in those hours at other hours, and then just agreed that we would true up at the end of the year. And so, you know, the firm I was with helped me come up with a solution, but there was no structural solution that really was available. I had the luxury, because my husband also is a lawyer, and we had the means to be paid 60% of my pay for that year until we got to the end of the year in order to make that work and have me be able to stay, you know, in kind of that legal structured workforce. So, you know, with those kinds of barriers, I think many women find themselves either choosing or needing to opt out. And so I was both lucky, but also experienced something that was challenging and I think pretty familiar. I think that is improving, but I still hear similar stories even today.
Absolutely. Well, as an in-house counsel, Deb, you and your peers are sort of in a unique position to compel law firms not just to talk the talk, but actually to walk the walk when it comes to diversity. And for example, I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about Microsoft's law firm diversity program.
Absolutely. And I do actually think it's important, we as corporate counsel sit in a position where, one, we can use our purchasing power to align with our values, in this case, diversity. And so we've chosen to do that, predating me in the general counsel role for sure. Fundamentally, our viewpoint is that it works best if it's kind of an incentive-based partnership as opposed to a stick that you're beating a firm over the head with. And so starting in 2008, we created an incentive-based program where the firms that we work with on a regular basis can earn a bonus on top of their fees at the end of the year if they hit certain diversity metrics. From 2008 to 2015, we saw really good progress in law firm representation overall and representation on Microsoft's Matters. What we didn't see, though, during that time period was increased diversity in leadership. And so starting in 2015, we adjusted the program to focus on diversity overall, but really with an emphasis on leadership at the firms. And we've seen over, the full period and then sort of that 2015 forward good progress as we look at diversity on our matters. In 2008, with diversity defined relatively broadly to include women, minorities, individuals with disabilities, individuals who identify as LGBTQ, went from 34% in 2008 to 63% diverse this last year. Leadership progress has been slower, but in the last 5 years, we've seen about a 5-point increase in diverse law firm partnership for the firms we're working with as well. And I do think we'll see that increase more quickly in future years. I think part of what we were seeing was a bit of a pipeline problem in those first couple of years. I think the biggest challenge with a program like this, though, is scale. There are only so many firms that we work with. And so I think we as an industry really are going to need to be thinking about how do we scale this broadly across industry? How do we get everybody working together to be sharing best practices and to have programs in place that really are helping move the dial?
Either Ben or Justice Liu, do you have any thoughts on the question of scale and the pipeline?
I do. I would like to say, listen, over 150 years ago, America's most challenged president left the Willard Hotel and marched to the White House, and he announced to his cabinet, we must change our tactics or lose the game. And of course, Abraham Lincoln was telling his cabinet he was going to announce the emancipation. And they urged him to wait until the new year, until January of 1863, so as not to cause panic. Microsoft has an enviable record for many years. Brad Smith and those who work with him have done remarkable things. There are others. Well, Walmart has done that. There are others, but we need more, just as Deb suggested. There's no one way to do this. But I would submit to you, Mansfield, which is something our firm is doing and other firms and companies are doing, which is basically applying the Rooney Rule to the practice of law. Art Rooney was the venerable owner of the Steelers, and Paul Tagliabue and another friend really were the authors of that idea. And but we need more than just the Mansfield Rule. We have to go beyond Mansfield. It's one thing for the senior white partner to take a younger woman partner or a minority partner with him or her for the client meeting. And fortunately, these days, you don't see much tokenism. They actually get to speak and they come back and they get to do the work. But I think that needs to change. We need to change origination credit. If the senior partner goes with the younger partner who's Black, the younger partner who's Asian, why aren't we sharing that credit 50-50? If there's 3 of us, why isn't it 1/3 each? So law firms must change their compensation systems. When that happens, the client sees the diverse lawyer differently. The diverse lawyer's peers at his or her firm see them differently. And most importantly, the attorney herself or himself begins to see themselves differently. I'm not the chairman of my firm because of my intelligence or my good looks. I hope We won't get too much affirmation for that, but I have business and it makes my observations interesting and insightful. And if I lose that, I'm like an actress no longer beautiful. Armed with that, I can use that to hopefully not simply advance my own career, but advance that of others. And hopefully use that as leverage to get others who are in the majority to do for diverse attorneys what has been done for them. And so that's where I think we need to go. We need to hold ourselves accountable in law firms, in corporations, on the bench. We must do a much better job of that.
Justice Liu, anything to add?
Well, I couldn't have said it any better than Deb and Ben. I think that as the conversation has indicated, I think the main problem that the profession faces today is not actually the sort of aggregate number we began with, but it's really about leadership, and it's about promotion and where people go inside the profession. I think it's fair to say that the foot in the door with respect to entry-level positions has become much more diverse over the last 10 or 20 years. I think the statistics bear that out in all the big firms. The question is, who gets to the top rank? And I think there you see the biggest disparities. In the studies that we've done, in 2014, 92% of equity partners at the big firms in America were white. 92% in 2014. Right. And then Ben mentioned the 1/5 statistic for women equity partners. That's been constant for 20 years, one generation already. So I think the question really is one about advancement. I will just say that with respect to the perspective from the courts, at least here in California, maybe it's a luxury to speak from California, which is a very diverse jurisdiction. But I think the public accountability and the public demand for diversity is strong here. And so decision makers, appointing authorities have had to think harder and think differently about who they bring up through the ranks. And this also permeates the bar associations and all the informal networks that Dev spoke of, that there just is and needs to be a continued greater consciousness about the informal relationships that really grease the wheels in a way for who moves up in the profession. And I think all of us, beginning with people like me, bear, I think, a great responsibility in our own outreach and in the people we talk to in trying to put this issue front and center. I've tried to do that in everything that I've done. I would say actually that California has done reasonably well with respect to the judiciary over the last several years, but that's been the result of very intentional effort. And we have to kind of recognize that and call it out consciously, because the usual habits just will not suffice.
I wanted to share a question from a member of the audience that I will throw out to any of you. It is, would more flexible working arrangements, changes in billable hours approach, in addition to what is expected of attorneys, 60 to 80-hour work weeks, help open and keep open doors for more? Anyone want to respond?
I'll say something really quickly. As someone who's been at home during the pandemic with 2 school-aged children, I'm all for this, and it is challenging, as many parents have discovered, to balance home and work life. Actually, I'm very curious, and I'll be interested in what Ben and Dev have to say about the experience of the pandemic. It has not been an equal experience, for everyone, because people's circumstances are really quite different. But one thing I think that I hope the most recent experience will engender is some conversation about whether there might be more flexible working relationships that work well, especially for the legal profession, where so much of what we do is on our screens. Might there not be ways to give people more time and flexibility in their day, just not having to commute, for example? Not only is it good for the environment, but it has saved people a great deal of time that they can use for their own well-being and their family obligations, or exercise or meditation, or anything to just promote wellness, which I might add is a very serious problem in our profession. We have some of the highest rates of substance abuse. We have some of the highest rates of depression, highest rates of dissatisfaction actually with our careers among profession. And so we should take this crisis in a way as another opportunity to rethink the way we do our work.
So I'm happy to jump in here as well. I do agree that we've proven that, over the last 9 months that we can be productive no matter where it is we're working. And so I do think that we will see more flexibility. I'm hoping we will across the profession, as we work our way out of the pandemic. I do, though, think that we will need to be very, very intentional about fostering networks, continuing to sponsor diverse talent and those sorts of things in a different way, to the extent that we are going to be seeing more of a remote workplace. I think, at least for me, I've discovered it takes a lot more intentional effort to do that as we all are geographically dispersed.
I just wanted to jump in, please, and I agree with what Deb and Justice Liu have said. There was a point Justice Liu made a moment ago about leadership, and I believe leaders must be fearless. They must be willing to challenge the status quo, particularly in a time like this, as Deb was alluding to. And I would say in our firm, these work policies that we've developed in recent years have made a difference. Approximately a third of our partners are women, equity partners. Some firms, they will count their partners, but they won't make a distinction between equity and non-equity. 33% equity. And I attribute that to the women in our firm who spoke up, women who spoke up on behalf of other women who themselves may not have primary responsibility for child rearing. And I would also hasten to add women and men who spoke up for a policy that actually benefited many men who also wanted and needed that flexibility for child rearing and other reasons. Listen, this is an inflection point, and the legal profession, like all lines of work, we're competing for talent. And if we make the mistake of limiting ourselves to half the people, right? I think it's Warren Buffett who said, look, we've only relied on half our people. Look how well we've done. Imagine if we relied on everyone. And that certainly holds true for minority attorneys. It also holds true for women attorneys. And we must change this now. And we must change it now.
Well, I'm afraid our time is up, but I want to thank you all for joining us and sharing your views. And thank you for our audience at Reuters Next.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. A genuine pleasure being with everyone.